And I'm just so happy that we have things that God has put in our hands, tools that empower us to live a life like that. Because our salvation's not just for heaven one day. Part of that experience is in our human experience now. Or part of that encounter is in our human experience now. One of the tools God gives us is His Word. The Bible isn't God. We have the Bible because there is a God. And it reveals the heart of God to us, but as the word says, it's also a light to our feet and a lamp to our path, or a lamp to our path, a light to our feet. And so the Word of God should and can direct much of the way we live out our human experience. It gives us revelation of the kingdom ways within the kingdom of the world. And this year, we feel that God has spoken to us as the church. And in some mystical way, if God speaks to us as the church, He's speaking to each one of us individually because we are the church. And in Isaiah 54, we feel that God has lit the path forward as we step into this new season of 2022 with a sense that somehow God is birthing new beginnings out of the very painful endings we experienced over the last period of the 2 years we've been in this pandemic. We feel like God is saying it's now time where you're going to begin seeing birth of something out of all of this. And we've had Isaiah as one of our inspirations in that, where it says, out of the stumps will come the holy seed. And the reference to stumps there is the devastation of Israel. Out of the devastation and the stumps that tell the story of devastation, God is birthing new life through holy seed, because our God is the God that brings life back from what was dead. And we believe now there is a real spiritual season in which you will begin to see, even in your personal life, good things again. Things you can celebrate that didn't seem to be part of the story in this previous season that we've come out of. And God has clearly shown us out of Isaiah 54 a promise of legacy for our personal lives and together as a church. And so out of Isaiah chapter 54, it begins where God says, sing, barren woman. He's talking to Israel, but we now translate that because it's contextualized to us today, because it's alive and active. And so, sing, O barren woman, for your descendants are going to spread out to the left and the right, more than the woman who had the ability to give birth. And it says, prepare and extend your tent pegs and hold no expense back, because I've given you this promise of generations, of legacy that will outlive you. And so we have sensed God, first of all, out of the scripture saying, sing, barren woman. In other words, praise me in your present problem of barrenness. So even though we might be in a season that's difficult, or we're in the presence of our enemies, we choose to intentionally focus on Him and praise. And then it says, because I've given you this promise of descendants that will occupy desolated cities and spread to the left and right, because your life is going to outlive you with the legacy you leave on earth if you are faithful together, I also want you to prepare. And it says in that same portion, when it says, sing, barren woman, praise me, then it says, enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch your tent curtains wide. Don't hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. In other words, don't just praise me with an intentional focus, but prepare in expectation for what I'm going to provide in a life of legacy that you will get the privilege of living. And so what we did is we said, well, how do we communicate this revelation in a clear and catchy way that will keep us remembering what God's told us? And we felt God say to us, this is about an intentional focus and an active faith. We feel like God's saying, come out of the season where you've been in this lockdown. Everyone's like unsure and not making decisions because we don't know what's happening next. Instead, rise up again, my children. Get your focus right again, intentionally, because when your focus is in the right place, you can praise God even in the presence of your enemies. Because your focus is on the God before you, not the enemy around you. So intentional focus, we're getting there again. We're saying we've got to stop this thing of the spiritual like lethargy where we're like, okay, got my focus intentionally. And then active faith, because it says we must now prepare, enlarge, stretch out. So we're saying, hey, faith without works is dead. It's time for God's people to rise up in their personal lives again and find that fire, that motivation, and let their hands go where they want their hearts to be in their service, in their activity together. And so, as part of embracing God's promise of a legacy, we are committed to intentional focus and active faith. It's on our wall. Some of you might have got it tattooed. We've got a wall behind there where people can sign their commitment to this year, having intentional focus, active faith. Maybe some of our team can ensure their black pens there afterwards. If you haven't got a chance to sign that, go and put your signature on there. It just represents us together committed to this. And so this is the journey we're on. But now we've got to live out this intentional focus and active faith. And once again, thank God for His word that helps shed light on how we can live this out. And there's the documented pages of history in the Old Testament where a man called David, we know him well as King David, lived a life in which at the end of it all, he saw the promise of legacy manifest as he handed over to his son Solomon and the next generation. And we find that in the Old Testament book of 1 Chronicles chapter 28. And it's just this incredible real life story of what we feel God has promised us together, that we can leave a life of legacy that outlives us. That at the end of it all, when people at your memorial, they're not going, well, Billy had a really nice boat. And I always looked at his house when I drove past. And I enjoyed 1 or 2 rides to Camps Bay in my Porsche. God's blessed you that way, enjoy it. But just ensure that you're blessed to be a blessing. Just saying. But that's not what you want to hear. You want to know at the end of your life that people were impacted by you. That somehow your life had meaning and significance, not just success. This is the promise of God for you and I, because in this world, you're not always going to be happy, but you can always live with meaning. And that's God's promise to you and I. And we see this in the life of David, who actually came to the end and was able to see the blessing and the impact on generations beyond him. And so we're going back into the life of this man, David, to learn about how he lived with intentional focus and active faith in order to embrace the fullness of the promise of legacy that God had given him. And we last week heard about David's life, and we heard from one of our young preachers, Daniel, about David and Goliath. And at the end of it all, he was explaining how we need to trust the process as God remains true to His promise, the way David did. So we're all walking away now. One of the lessons we've learned is as we embrace intentional focus, active faith, it requires we trust the process because God's working out the promise. Today I want to look at another aspect of David. And it's interesting that when David was anointed king, or right after God gave David the promise of becoming Israel's king, from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16, then the ruling king of Israel at the time called David to go and serve him by playing the harp in his presence, because David was a muso. And so we read of the response of David's father, Jesse, to this request from the king of Israel, Saul, who wanted David to come and serve him. And we read that from 1 Samuel chapter 16. It says, "And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat and sent them by David his son to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service." David came to Saul and entered his service. The first thing David did after being given a promise by God that he would live a life of legacy was to enter the service of others. You see, God elevates us into His promises from the places in which we faithfully serve. Therefore, instead of perhaps sulking with disappointment because of the place you're in, start serving others with the gifts you've been given. Because then, like Joseph in the Old Testament who served others while in a prison place, it will become the platform elevating you to the palace before the king, and then into the fullness of promise as was manifest in Joseph's life as he became the governor over Egypt's people. Just like Joseph, or like David, God will elevate you into His promises from the places in which you faithfully serve others with your gifts. This is revelation. I'm not making up or giving you opinion, because Proverbs 18 verse 16 clearly says, giving a gift can open doors. Giving a gift, bringing your gift, releasing from the gift you've been given, can open doors in your personal life. So can I encourage you to stop seeking the perfect place in which to use your gifts and start using them where you are to open the doors that will lead you into the places of promise you've been looking for. So maybe the open door you've been praying for is waiting for you to start serving where you are with what you have. Proverbs 18:16, giving a gift can open doors. David gave his gift of musical skill to serve the king of Israel, Saul. And as I reflect on this idea that he was kind of jamming for the king, so Saul had issues, and music helped him chill out. So I can just imagine David, if it was modern times, it wouldn't have been the harp. He would have just pulled out a little blues. Chill the guy out. David had the gift of musical skill that he gave to serve Saul, the king of Israel. As I thought about that, I thought of the descriptions of Proverbs 18:16 we read now from the King James Version that says this. It says, a man's gift makes room for him. One version says it opens the doors. This one says it makes room for him. See, David was not yet sitting on the throne God had promised him. But as David faithfully served Saul with his gift, he was in some way making room for his rule on the very seat of the throne of the king he was busy serving. Serving with our gifts like David opens doors and makes room for God's promises. And this is why using your gifts is so important. It's not just meeting a need for someone else. It's part of your personal process toward God's provision in your life. And here's the crazy thing. We all have gifts. Because the New Testament book of 1 Peter 4 verse 10 tells us, God has given each of you a gift from His great variety of gifts, spiritual gifts. Use them well to serve one another. As we've said, serving others with your gifts will open doors, elevating you into God's promises. But not only does it do that, the documented pages of history from the Bible record Jesus saying that if we are faithful with the gifts God has given us, we will be rewarded in heaven. Jesus says from Matthew chapter 25, verse 21, that God will say to those who use their gifts faithfully, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Faithful serving leads us and makes room for the much of God. And at the end of it all, the serving is not just opening doors in our personal lives, but it's actually part of the reward we wait for from God one day. Suddenly I'm like, okay, I'm not serving because the church needs me. I'm serving because I want all God has for me. When we faithfully serve others with our God-given gifts, we aren't only opening doorways toward His promises in our personal lives, but we're rewarded by God as individuals who will hold an account. In fact, when Jesus is speaking of the good and faithful servant here, it's in the context of what God will hold us accountable for at the end of our lives, what we did with the gifts He gave. So let's explore this a bit more by reading Jesus' words documented in Matthew 25 from verse 14 as He was describing our personal entry into heaven. And he says this, "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I've made 5 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you had scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours.' But the master answered him, 'You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who had 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, into the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So, when it comes to serving with our gifts like David did, the first thing we must acknowledge, based on what Jesus has said here, is that God doesn't judge the ability of our gifts, but their availability to Him. So God gave a gift to each servant, it says, according to his ability. This is important to understand, because God rewards what you're able to do, not what you can't. So Jesus describes the fact that God doesn't judge the ability of our gifts, but their availability to Him. When we look at the 2 servants that were given talents that used them to the best of their ability, the servant with the 5 and the servant with the 2 talents. Now, one used the 5 to his best ability, and one used the 2 to his best ability. And even though their 2 portions were not equal in size, their reward was still the same. Only one only brought a double portion of 4, and the other 10. Yet God responded the same way to both of those servants that did the best they could with what they had, when they both got rewarded with the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much." God didn't say, the other oak brought 10, eh? You only brought 4, sorry. Because God gifted them based on their ability, meaning that God doesn't judge the ability of our gifts, but their availability to Him. If He's given you a 2-star ability, He doesn't expect a 5-star return. And one of the enemy's greatest strategies for keeping the doors of God's promises closed in our personal lives is to convince us that the size of our gifting or ability determines the scope of our impact. Well, God, my gifting isn't as big as that person. And then we look at things and we think, what's the point of even trying? It's not even worth anything in comparison to him and her and her. What's the point of using my 2 talents when I don't have 5 like his? They don't need my service. Look how good they are already. I'll just bury mine. Let's not forget, though, that service opens doors for you personally. It's actually got nothing to do with the size of another person's gift. And you're rewarded by God independently of them for your availability with what you were given. It's not only about getting a job done or helping others when there's a need. It's more about making your gifts and abilities available to God, who will hold you accountable for what you did with what He gave you, not what He gave others. Galatians 6 verse 4 in the Message says, make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you have been given, and then sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. God doesn't judge the ability of our gifts, but their availability to Him. So I ask you this question. How are you making your gifts available to God? Number one, God doesn't judge the ability of our gifts, but their availability to Him. And number two, it's about faithfulness with the gift we've got, not attainment of the gifts we want to have. Jesus, in verse 23, describes the response of God in rewarding those who served with what they had as good and faithful servants. It's about faithfulness with the gifts you've got, not attainment of the gifts you want to have. You make what you have available to God and stop comparing, and then you remain faithful with what you've got instead of comparing, and you don't spend your life trying to attain the gifts that someone else has got. Don't become an unfaithful servant because you don't like the size of your fruit. Let's not forget that David started by faithfully serving King Saul as a musician. And the scope of impact from that seemingly small act would open doors toward a destiny of legacy in his life, which is now recorded in the pages of history found in the Old Testament. In the place you're in right now, how faithful are you with the gifts and abilities God's given you, regardless of their size? Grant, it's like, this is all cool that you say, but I tried once doing that serve thing, like using my gift or just being available to help out, and it was just, I've tried this. My response to you is, well, keep trying. Because, like we've just read, God rewards faithful servants, not successful ones. Well, praise God, Bobby's been in church for 35 years, served every week, is the best musician we've ever seen. Bobby knew all the worship songs backwards. He could read the Bible from beginning to end. He knew it in his head. And then God says, well done. Your success in the eyes of the Christian religion, but out of my relationship, I wanted to reward you for faithfulness with the little bit that I had given you instead. It wasn't about how successful you made yourself as a spiritual person. It was about your faithfulness using the gift God had given you even when you failed. You see, so we don't stop trying because we did it once and I didn't have that magic thing you said would happen if I read the Bible. It didn't go boom when I started serving and then my life was like all special. It was just hard work and it was dumb because it's just, I wanted to stay longer at the Bri on Saturday night. And this is just, I don't like this thing because I've tried it before. Well, can I encourage you to keep trying because God rewards faithful servants, not successful ones. See, as we've said already, in this parable that Jesus spoke, God was not judging the servants on the size of their return. Otherwise, the one with the 4 talents would have been compared to the one with the 10. God was rewarding the fact that they used what they had been given instead of bearing it like the third servant with the smallest talent. The servant who buried his gift responded to the master in verse 25 saying, I was afraid. I was afraid. I was afraid of like getting too Christian, like now you're serving and now you're hectic in our church. Or I was afraid because I'm an introvert. Well, Jesus made you an introvert, meaning He wants you to serve out of that space and not force yourself to be something you're not. That's okay. Well, I'm just afraid that then I'm like signing my life off. Well, we can work through that and help you find something that works. I'm just afraid because I don't know what your fear is, but this servant buried the very gifting God had given him out of fear. And I ask you today, what fear has been holding you back from using your gifts in serving others? Servant said to his master, I was afraid and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. You have what is yours. And so I want to ask that question again, but a little differently. What fear has been holding you back from using His gifts given to you for His glory? What fear has been holding you back from using His gifts given to you for His glory? You see, it was never the servant's talent to bury. And as I reflected on that, I was reminded of the famous quote from pastor and author A.R. Bernard, who said, life is God's gift to us. What we do with it is our gift to God. In some way, I gift God by using the gifts He's given me in my life on earth, regardless of their size. I serve with the gifts for God. I don't serve with the gifts because someone needs my help. I don't serve with the gifts because other people will see and I will be popular. I don't serve with my gifts because that's just the expectation. I ultimately serve with my gift because I'm giving it back to God. So when I get tired or I say I've tried or, look how much better that musician is than me, you don't have to worry about people because you're not serving for people. You're serving for God because He's given you the gift. That is how you are giving it back to Him. And that's why Colossians 3 verse 23 tells us this. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. Since you know that you will, here it is, that you will, when you work for God and no one else, you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Like David, faithfully serving for God. Yeah, but you're supposed to be the king, and now you're sitting with the king on the throne you're supposed to be sitting on. Shouldn't you be fighting for it? No, I'm surrendered in service to God. And every moment he was faithful in his service, it was from that platform that God elevated him closer toward the promise of becoming the king. So maybe you're going, okay, I never realized how personally important serving was for myself. I thought I was helping Southside Church out. You can go and help somewhere else like the SBCA, no strings attached. You're not a volunteer here. You are the church. And you need to own the vision. It's not mine to make. I'm not a public service. I'm here to empower you for the good works. Because God calls us to serve. You might be going, well, you know what? I understand that now, but you don't know my situation. It's so hectic having 5 kids. Jeez, if you have 5 kids, may the Lord bless you. But you might be saying, you don't know my situation. And you might have a really good reason why you're not serving God yet or taking advantage of finding a way to serve in some way. Well, the servant that buried his talent used that excuse. He spoke about the fact that the circumstances surrounding his one talent were not ideal for multiplying because the master was kind of a hard man. So he was like, it's like difficult, my situation. Can I encourage you with the words of Ecclesiastes 11:14? It tells us that if you wait for the perfect conditions, you will never get anything done. If Joseph didn't wait If Joseph had waited while in prison until things were better before he served God. If David decided tending the sheep, like it's a situation, I can't now go and serve Saul on the throne. And both of these men, whether in prison or tending sheep, started where they were with what they had. And the best way for you and I to use our gifts, regardless of their size or our challenging situation, is to start somewhere. David's somewhere was as a musician in the palace, faithfully serving until it led him to God's promise as a king. And so I think as I land this morning, I want to leave you with one question of reflection personally, and then I want to pray. The question is this. You guys are so good. You like to know my vibe now. So what gifts are you able to serve others with, and where is your somewhere going to be? Where are you going to start? Because we start somewhere. So what can you do? How can you make a contribution in serving God and serving others somewhere? Will you close your